Good morning, all of you. Here comes our new chapter, new interesting topic to discuss today. Are you all excited? Today we are going to discuss about deficit spending and public debt. Welcome to the lecture. In this chapter, we have 4 learning objectives. First, to explain how the federal government budget deficit occurs and define the public debt. The second objective is to evaluate the circumstances under which the public debt could be a burden to future generations. The third objective is to analyze the macroeconomic effects of government budget deficits. The fourth objective is to describe the possible ways to reduce the government budget deficit. We'll discuss each objective one by one. And if you have any questions, any of your ideas, any of your thoughts, you can share that on this topic in different sections like the Google Doc that I have shared with you. You can ask question over there. You can also post your views on the discussion board, and if you want, you can also post any new articles on this topic at tweet section. Feel free to contact me for any questions or any clarifications you need on this chapter. Let us now discuss about the learning objective 4 to describe the possible ways to reduce the government budget deficit. This is the figure related to US deficit. The United States exported more than it imported until mid-1970s. Then it started experiencing large trade deficits. The federal budget has been in deficit more years since 1960s. Now, we'll talk about the growing US government deficits and what are the implications for US economic performance. Many economists, they argue that it is no accident that the foreign residents hold a large portion of the US public debt. The reasoning suggests that a US trade deficit, a situation in which the value of US imports of the goods and services exceeds the value of exports, will often accompany a government budget deficit. In addition, most economists, they recommend that the government budget deficits can have significant implications as well for the overall economy. So today we are going to discuss about the trade deficits or government budget deficits. As you can see here, the major portion is held by China and Japan and other countries. So, we'll answer the question, how do higher deficit affect the economy in the short run? So, if the economy is below the full employment, then there is increase in the aggregate demand due to higher spending or lower taxes. the deficit can close the recessionary gap. If the economy is already at full employment, there is increase in the aggregate demand. The deficit can create an inflationary gap with increased real GDP and inflation. So basically, this slide shows that the answer to this question depends on what is the initial state of the economy, whether the economy is below the full employment or the economy is already at full employment. Not only in the short run, but also in the long run, it is going to impact the US economic growth. So the question is, what are the long run macroeconomic effects of higher budget deficits? In a long run, the macroeconomic equilibrium, the economy has actually adjusted to changes in the factors. When I talk about factors, I mean there can be changes in the government spending, either increase or decrease in the government spending. Not only government spending, but also changes in the taxes. That results in the government budget deficit. Although increasing the government budget deficit raises the aggregate demand. It enhances the aggregate demand. And we have discussed that in the previous class also. So, when there is increase in the budget deficit, it raises the aggregate demand. In the long run equilibrium, real GDP remains at the full employment level. Further, any further increase in the government deficit via higher government spending or expenditure or tax cut can result in inflation. And they have no effect in the equilibrium real GDP, which remains at the full employment level in the long run. The fact that the long run equilibrium real GDP is unaffected in the face of increased government deficits has important implication. And what is that? In the long run, higher government budget deficit have no effect on the equilibrium real GDP per year. Ultimately, government spending in excess of the government receipts simply redistributes a larger share of the real GDP per year to government provided goods and services. Hence, if government operates with higher budget deficits over an extended period, the ultimate result will be shrinkage in the share of private goods and services by continuing spending more than it collects. And that takes up a larger portion of the economic activity. So, what are the possible ways to reduce the government budget deficit? Or how could the government reduce all of its red ink? Well, there have been many suggestions about how to reduce the government budget deficit. One way to reduce the government budget deficit is to increase the tax collection. Due to COVID-19, the 2020s will be a decade of deficits. And to read more about this article, you can use this link and read detail about the national debt. Many economists, they suggest that by increasing the taxes for everyone, the federal government can reduce the deficit. From an arithmetic point of view, a federal budget deficit can be wiped out by more amount of taxes to be collected. Deficit for the financial year 2018 was around 779 billion, a 113 billion increase or 17% increase from the financial year 2017. Deficit is about 3.9 percentage of the GDP with an increase of 3.5 percentage in 2017. The Office of the Budget and Management estimated the 2015 budget deficit to be around $563 billion. To have eliminated the deficit by raising the taxes, every worker in the US would have to pay around $4,000 more in taxes. Reality is such that we'll never see the federal government budget deficit wiped out by simply increasing the tax amount or tax rates. The second option is you know to raise the taxes on rich. What does it mean to tax the rich? If you talk about taxing the millionaire, you are referring to those who pay taxes more than 1 million in income per year. There are fewer than 300,000 of them. Even if you were to double the taxes they pay now, the reduction in deficit would be relatively very small. Changing the marginal taxes at the upper end would produce similarly unimpressive results. IRS or the Internal Revenue Service has determined that an increase in the top marginal tax rate from 35% to 45% would raise at best about $40 billion in additional taxes. Extra revenues of this 40 billion per year represent only about 7% of the estimated 2015 federal budget deficit. The reality is that data do not support the notion that the tax increase can actually eliminate deficits. Although eliminating a deficit in this way is possibly, arithmetically it may be correct, but politically it is just, the just opposite have occurred. When more tax revenues have been collected, taxes, or tax amounts, the government usually responded by increasing the government spending. So, maybe this is not one of the right way to control or to manage the federal budget deficits. Reducing expenditure is another way to decrease the federal budget deficit. There are different components of government spending as a percentage of the total expenditure. For example, military spending on national defense has risen slightly in the recent year, although it remains much lower than the previous years. During the period from the conclusion of the World War II until 1972, the military spending was one of the important aspects of the federal budget. But now, entitlements are one of the important component of the federal budget deficit today. Federal budget today. Entitlements are the legislated federal government payment that anyone who qualifies is entitled to receive, and these include payments like the Social Security, other income security programs, Medicare, Medicaid. Entitlements are consequently called as the non-controllable expenditure or non-discretionary expenditure unrelated to the national defense that automatically change without any action taken by the Congress. There is a question: is it time to begin whittling away at entitlements. In 1960, spending on the entitlements represented about 20% of the total federal budget. Today, entitlement expenditure make up more than 60% of the total expenditure. Consider the Social Security, Medicare. In constant 2019 dollars, in 2015, the Social Security, Medicare represented about $2.3 trillion of the expenditure or the federal expenditure. And this calculation excludes the military and other international payments or interest on the government debt. Entitlement payments on the Social Security, Medicaid now exceed all other domestic spending. They are growing faster than any other part of the federal government budget. During the past 2 decades, the real spending on the entitlements grew about 7 and 8% per year, while the economy was growing less than 3% per year. Social Security payments are growing in real terms at about 6% per year, but the Medicare and Medicaid are growing at double-digit rates. The passage of the Medicare prescription drug begins in 2003, and the new federal healthcare legislation in 2010 added to the already rapid growth of the healthcare entitlements. Many people believe that the entitlement programs are necessary federal expenditure. Interest on the public debt must be paid, but Congress can change just about every other federal expenditure labeled necessary. Federal budget deficit is not expected to drop in the near future because these programs are not likely to be reduced. Government have trouble cutting the government benefit program once they are established. So if you are offering a new benefit program, you have to continue it. So one must conclude that containing the federal budget deficit is really a very challenging and difficult task. So if we define the entitlements, these are the guaranteed benefits under the government programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And if you want to define the non-controllable expenditure, basically government spending that changes automatically without any action by the Congress are called as non-controllable expenditure. Now have a look at the figure 14.5, which shows the component of federal expenditures as the percentage of the total federal spending. Although military spending as a percentage of the total federal spending has risen and fallen with the changing national defense concerns, national defense expenditure as a percentage of the total spending have generally trended downward since 1950s. Social Security and other income security programs and Medicare and other health programs are now accounting for larger shares of the total federal spending than any other program. Now, what if the richest were to respond to higher average and marginal income tax rate by engaging in fewer activities subject to taxation? The wealthiest American actually managed to pay less in taxes. The additional revenues which is derived from imposing the higher taxes on the rich are likely to be lower than anticipated. Thus, the deficit reduction benefit from levying higher tax rates on the rich is likely to be smaller than projected. For example, the capital gain management income modification borrowing tactics, there are several ways. They find ways to pay less tax. So even if the projection was really on getting more tax, collecting more tax, it is actually less. Here I am showing you a book titled Red Ink by David, who was writing on this, where the trillions come from, where they go, and why inaction imperils our future, focusing on the high stakes politics of federal budget. In considering how the expenditure might be reduced, it is very important to look at the entitlements. These are federal government payment that are legislated obligations and cannot be reduced or eliminated. Entitlements are the largest component of US federal budget. To make a significant cut in expenditures, entitlement programs would have to be revised. Here is another example how government collect funds to make a balanced budget, or how to cover up for the deficits. So if you want a balanced budget, sell some of your government assets. Iraq's government has considered raising revenues by selling a large amount of its real estate, including the presidential palaces, which was previously constructed by nation's dictator Saddam Hussein. The deceased dictator built 75 palaces in total. Like Iraq, a number of other governments the world have raised revenues by selling their assets in order to reduce their net public debt. So, is fiscal policy drowning in accumulated budgetary red ink? There are two figures in panel A and panel B to show the actual and projected net interest payment on the public debt. In panel A, you can see, the federal government projects that the annual net interest payment on the public debt will be more than double between now and 2025. As a result, as you can see in panel B, the portion of the GDP that the government can allocate to discretionary spending will likely have to be declined. So, if an individual continually spends more than his income, he will eventually go bankrupt. The same must be true for the federal government. What do you think of this statement? Well, first, the federal government is theoretically immortal, while an individual is not. Thus, unlike an individual debt, the public debt does not have to be paid off at any particular time in future. Second, the federal government has the power to tax. As long as the government can raise enough tax revenue to keep investor confidence in the government can simply sell new securities to pay off the old one as they come due. Finally, the federal government has the power to issue money. Do you have any more ideas on this? You can share your thoughts on the discussion board. Tell me if reducing deficit is a good idea. To reduce the deficit, it requires an increase in the taxes or decrease in spending. Maybe some will say, we don't want that in my district or state. The bias toward the deficit spending. If they would support reducing the deficit by cutting the funding of the federal work study program and other student aid programs for the next year in order to reduce the deficit. What will be your reaction to this? Thank you very much. If you have any questions relating to this chapter, feel free to write your question on the Google Doc that I have shared with you, as well as you can share your ideas and thoughts on the discussion board. Thank you.